Hello and welcome to History Respawned, the podcast. I'm your host, John Harney, and I'm joined by Bob. Hey, Bob.
Hey, John, how are you?
I am good, thanks. You know, Bob, it was my idea to call the podcast, and I just thought we should sit down and kind of, rap a little, as the kids said, I think in the 1970s. I'm not sure. I'm now making airplane movie references without meaning to. Just to talk about like kind of what's happening in games, and maybe we'll start kind of chatting a bit more often and putting it out there. So a little bit of history content later because we can't help ourselves, but we're gonna. I don't know, Bob. Are you okay with getting all current?
Sure, let's do it. Just like the
We're gonna do it,
kids. Yeah.
just like the kids. So I don't have a newswire reel, but we thought we'd talk a little bit how things are going. I guess the big story this week, and get ready to have your minds blown, but as Bob and I give you our full financial analysis, is whatever the heck is going on with the GameStop shorting Redditors Robinhood app kind of scenario. And if you're not fully up to speed on what's going on, the short version is that for quite a while now, a group of Redditors on the site Reddit called the Wall Street Bets Reddit, they've been doing things like this for a long time. And at some point, people noticed that GameStop was probably going to have long-term problems, that it was selling less games than it had. Yes, the pandemic hasn't helped, but also, the fact that you can buy a PlayStation 5 with no disc drive in it does not really bode well for their business model, which relied pretty heavily on used games and all the rest of it. And so people would do this thing called shorting, which effectively is that you are borrowing the shares from someone who has shares in this case in GameStop. You are and you are effectively you are selling the shares then for, let's say, $5 a share, whatever it was. And as GameStop goes further into its death cycle, you've pocketed the $5 and you'll pay the $2 to buy back the requisite number of shares to give it back to the person from whom you borrowed it. Bob, did that sound even remotely
That
intelligible?
sounds relatively intelligible. There's plenty of articles explaining this online.
That's a great point.
But
The
this
Ringer,
this is a really interesting story, I think, for both of us because GameStop is based in Grapevine, Texas, which is a place where both of us have lived at different times in our lives.
That's right.
And so it's something that's close to home, and it's really interesting to see this company at the center of this kind of attack on hedge funds, on kind of Wall Street establishment perpetrated by a group of, they call them Redditors, but they're just investors, just like anybody else, just normal people. Well, maybe not normal people because they're on Reddit. But yeah, and so it's really interesting, I think, for me, I'm sure it is for you, to think about GameStop being in this kind of position, because it is one of those places where, they had a great deal of power in a couple of console generations ago with the 360 PS3. It was kind of their heyday. But now as things have gone digital, it does seem like one of those weary titans that is going to eventually collapse, like a lot of other brick and mortar stores. And I think that that's what those who are shorting the stock were assuming was going to happen, or probably hoping would happen. And I think it's curious to me that this kind of issue between the hedge fund and the small investors has sprouted up over GameStop. But I think that's, the people investing from that Reddit group were really encouraged by what they saw with, the most recent quarterly reports coming out of GameStop, where it seems like they're doing better than was expected. But of course, a lot of that, I think what gets lost in this is that GameStop is closing a lot of stores. They're getting rid of a lot of employees. So it's not like this plucky, company that is beating the odds, fighting back against this shortening thing. It is a company that is really doing a lot of things that nasty capitalist companies do when times get tough, is they tighten their belts and they get rid of employees. So it's kind of a weird thing. I don't know. It's strange to see this kind of story in not just the game press, but then like it's front page news in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. But I wish that there was kind of a little bit more nuance with the way that the story is being told.
Yeah, there's a lot of weird wrinkles to it. I mean, so for example, I think a lot of us have considered GameStop to be kind of a dead man walking for a while, but I've been reading some interesting analyses pointing out, well, they kind of had a lot of cash on hand. last year, and so they were actually in a lot better health than you probably think they were.
Mhm.
One of the reasons the shorting issue has caused the price to go flying up quite so high is that some of these hedge funds in particular, they were effectively like they were shorting more stock that actually existed,
Mhm.
which is a bet that will pay off if the company goes bankrupt. And so now there's all this kind of weird panic. And then, we see it in US Congress, people like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez on one side, and, people who are usually very much ideologically opposed to her in terms of things like financial matters and stuff, effectively agreeing that it's not right that Robinhood, which is this very popular app that anybody listening can use to buy and sell stock, made it possible to sell GameStop stock, but stopped you from buying anymore yesterday. And this felt kind of like an artificial bending of the market that upset a lot of people. But as you say, Bob, it's intriguing because, Ocasio Cortez, she had this stream of Among Us that got like, I think 300,000 viewers or something only a couple months ago. So there's this kind of, I think that outside the quote unquote gaming world, there are these mutual assumptions, which is, oh, these weirdos are messing with the system in this kind of assumption that you're into video games, you're some weird, person. Or perhaps if you follow Ocasio Cortez but don't play games, oh, the gamers are doing something cool. And neither of those is really the case, right? These are just
Mhm.
people. In fact, we don't actually know who they are. I mean, and the joke going on Twitter the other day was, a GameStop stock is now trading at $385, which means you can get it for, if you sell it, you get $14.50, I think was the joke that I saw. This is so there's this like level of bitterness then of people who remember or who feel like they were stiffed by GameStop
Yeah.
during the 360 PS3 era, for example.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
So no, so it's fascinating. So I don't know. I mean, it's funny, Bob, because I joke about not knowing much about the financial side, but I end up thinking more about it's just yet another example of games feel mainstream, but then these kind of cliches about quote unquote gamers just they don't seem to go anywhere. They
Mhm.
hang around. Maybe,
Mhm.
or maybe that just tells us the median age in the American Congress is slightly higher than the rest of the country. Maybe that's
It could be it, or I think it's just when we get these cliches, they're very difficult to overcome. It's very difficult to
yeah,
overcome a stereotype once it's set in. And, I think most people, if you read the ESA and their reports, yearly reports about the type of people who play games, everybody, all types of people
yeah,
play games. But there is this kind of old cliche of, the angry white dude living in his mom's basement playing
right,
Fortnite or
right.
what have you, or Call of Duty, more likely. And I think that kind of crutch for telling a story about games is one that's going to be with us for a while, even though it doesn't. I mean, it still exists for sure.
Right, yeah.
Just go play Call of Duty online, but it's one that I think will gradually change over time. But it takes a long time to get over that.
Yeah, and it's funny, I've gotten really involved with esports here at Centre College where I work, and there are people who want to help the esports program who kind of see it as a way to ameliorate these supposed social problems that are just inherent in video game play. But then when you get a team together, you find out, okay, this is a person who they speak the language of competitive video games, which is to say that they're just awful to be around when they're playing video games. And so it's really fascinating how you do have that kind of persistent kind of I don't know, toxicity or vibe or
Hmm.
whatever. But the other side of it, then I remember somebody said to me, "Would you consider getting the players to do laps and do physical training, conditioning training as part of being part of the esports program?" And I was kind of thought to myself, well, I thought to myself, would I want to do laps? And I thought, no. So I didn't want to do it. And then a couple of the players themselves suggested to me, what if we did that? And so even in, I just feel like, and even in the work that we do with History Respond, none of these, what's the word? None of the cliches hold up for very long. I think in part because the audience has widened so much.
Hmm.
So I wonder if GameStop is the first of like a series of these weird things. I don't know which company would be next. Xfinity, maybe. I don't know. Um, American
Xfinity is doing
Airlines.
pretty well, but
That's true. Yeah.
I just read now. I was on the Washington Post website, and they said that AMC Theaters, a very big theater chain in the
Right.
United States, is now out of $600 million in debt because of this campaign by Redditors to buy up their stock. So it's it's fascinating. I think this whole
Yeah.
story, and it's interesting to have games play a central role in this story regarding finance and economics, but this is the world we live in. I think that
Hmm.
for most people, it does come as a bit of surprise that games have moved into this central role in American culture and American business, right? This is an
Right,
industry that's bigger than film. It's
right.
bigger than television. So it's not, I mean, it shouldn't come as a big shock, but I think it is coming as a big shock.
Yeah, The Economist had an article of the day covering Cyberpunk 2077. I read The Economist a lot, and The Economist rarely discusses video games. And it was it was a really good article, and it was a really interesting article. And it had some throwaway comments about the violence in the game, which in fairness, the game is actually quite violent. Um, but it really kind of covered it as an example. CD Projekt Red is a Polish company, a European company, and the extent to which European video games as an industry, from their perspective, as an economics kind of analysis outlet, um, is exhibiting all the problems of kind of Europe as a continent, which is European political leaders are just completely focused on coal and cars and the real backbone of like a 1970s economy, and they have a company like CD Projekt Red, and nobody knows what to do with them. So yes, Cyberpunk had all these problems, but it also sold like bucket loads of copies. As The Economist said, if I forget which example, but if Disney released a movie that made $600 billion or something, they wouldn't lose too much sleep that it was bad, or
Hmm.
that like the critics thought it was terrible. And
Hmm.
so video games gets into this really interesting space.
Hmm.
You know. Well, that actually has to be got into the next news item, and two of two, which Jason Schreier, who now works for Bloomberg, and listeners probably remember Schreier. We've mentioned it before. He wrote a great book called Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. He was at Kotaku for a long time, and now he's a reporter at Bloomberg, writing fantastic stuff. He had an excellent piece on Cyberpunk only the other week, discussing a lot of the internal problems in the production of that game. And he has an article out this morning talking about Amazon games, which was really useful. Now, Bob, did you get a chance to read this
I did
yet?
not. I love Schrader's work, but I haven't got a chance to read
Yeah.
this.
So I'll do a quick kind of summary then. So effectively, Schreier is talking about Amazon at one point. So Amazon owns Twitch. They bought Twitch, and they sell video games, of course, through the Amazon service, the same way they sell books and all these other things and PC components and everything else. But the article is specifically about Amazon Games, the division of the company that is going to make and publish video games, their own video games. And what they and so the article is examining some of the issues they've had. At one point, they had 4 games publicly announced, all of which were supposed to kind of upend and change the video game kind of market effectively. And they released a game, Crucible, a few months ago, which was effectively kind of a Destiny kind of group shooter looter kind of idea. And Crucible, they actually pulled it back off the virtual shelves. It was such a disaster. And I played Crucible one evening, and I'm sorry to say they made very much the correct decision to take. It was awful. It was just awful. And they have New World, which is this kind of MMO. Supposedly, it's an MMO where you colonize a foreign land inhabited by local indigenous people who sure look a lot like Native Americans. And when this was put to Amazon, they're like, "Oh no, there's no way." And the article points out they then hired a consultant who came in and said, "You can't publish this game, right? Like you can't do this. This is offensive." So they have all these kind of issues. I also played a little bit of New World, and similar to Crucible, and in fairness, New World was still in beta, very kind of undercooked, And on what Schreier's article, the thrust of the article is that they took a guy. The thrust of the article, the thesis of the article, is that Amazon is determined to make its game division work the quote unquote Amazon way, which is Amazon has a whole series of corporate kind of ideas, motifs, practices, ethoses, really, um, that have been very, very effective for them. They kind of began in the book selling world online, but they have since used to sell all kinds of goods. And in the Amazon Prime ecosystem, Amazon Video, all these things, they've successfully maintained a corporate culture across all these regions. But in the game space, it's failing really quite miserably. In fact, spectacularly. And Schreier's argument is that, in effect, Amazon are missing out on the fact that there's a pretty big difference between the way a video game company works, especially if you're talking like AAA titles, and the way that the rest of Amazon works. So he puts a lot of blame at the guy heading Amazon Games, this gentleman named Mr. Frazzini, who has a successful track record at Amazon. He's the guy who successfully negotiated the purchase of Twitch for, I think it was 800 billion or something like that, which turned out to actually be a very good deal for Amazon. And or sorry, no, I've got the number completely wrong. But anyway, he put Amazon, and he kind of rose up through the ranks. He's kind of an Amazon guy, and he's made a lot of interesting decisions. He's hired a lot of very prominent people, like Clint Hocking, for example, of Far Cry 2 fame, many of whom have since left the company. And then he made some interesting decisions. So he decided he didn't want to use Unreal Engine or Unity, that Amazon would build their own tool set, which is called Tool Game Engine, which is called Lumberyard, which has proven an absolute. The people working in Amazon, at least those who talk to Schreier, hate it, and argue that it just is completely ineffective and isn't really working. And Amazon Games has a budget of $500 million a year, and that's separate from Twitch. That's just to produce and then subsequently release video games. And Frazzini and Frazzini reports to the guy who runs Amazon Web Services, and Jeff Bezos, by all accounts, is involved in this too. There's kind of a big picture idea that they will be able to both use their games to draw gamers into Amazon Web Services, and also simultaneously leverage Amazon Web Services to empower the games in some way and bring in features. And a lot of this is pie in the sky stuff, but if you think of what Google Stadia's supposed selling point was, that you'll be streaming a game and suddenly you're playing the game and all that kind of stuff, Amazon has similar kind of dreams. And what we have so far are multiple games cancelled and one game that looks very badly undercooked. So it's really fascinating. I really encourage people to go to Bloomberg and check it out. Bloomberg has a paywall, but it will let you read articles up to a certain point. And if you look for Schreier, Amazon Games, you'll find it. So it's fascinating. And so his central thesis, as I said, is that effectively Amazon are trying to push a kind of a corporate culture that has been very successful onto a style of onto game production which just isn't responding. He argues because you have this mixture of art, entertainment awareness, in addition to the technical, that you just don't have in in the other aspects of Amazon's business.
Mhm. So Amazon bought Twitch several years ago for $970 million.
Million. My apologies. I said billion. I was like, that can't be.
It's okay.
That's a COVID stimulus bill price. That's not. But yeah,
so that's very good business, I think.
Yes,
And
yes.
I feel like we're turning into a Bloomberg podcast right now. But it is interesting to me. I think that you would just assume, like I would just assume, prior to the creation of Amazon's game division, that they would just succeed at this by dint of having a lot of money. But that's not the case. And I think you could easily say the same thing right now for Stadia. It's, Google has all the money in the world and are not making a success of this. And I think you could also look at what Apple is starting to do. There's news this past week about them getting into virtual reality. They've tried to build up their selling of games at the very least. But I'd say that has not been a big success so far. So it's interesting. I think there was definitely a sense maybe 5 years ago when all of this started that you looked at the landscape and you saw Steam, you saw the major console creators and then the major development companies. And you looked and said, well, I mean, Amazon, Apple, Google, they could just jump right into this and dominate the whole thing. And that's just, that hasn't been the case.
Happened.
And that's surprising to me. I mean, maybe that speaks more to my own ignorance about how all this stuff works, but I feel like we're both pretty well versed in the business of games, at least in the past decade. And I think I'm still surprised, from 5 years on, that kind of progress hasn't been made.
Yeah, Schreier's a great journalist, and his article has lots of fantastic little details. And I think there's really interesting contrasts. So he talks about frustration among some who've now left Amazon at like having to produce a 6-page document to make an argument for like a major process. I'm like, well, guys, that's a pretty normal thing, like in these corporate environments. It's really not the end of the world. You'd be asked to kind of make pitches and so on. But at the same time, like you say, like the blunderbuss of money just isn't working. And then, you can see these examples of, Frazini coming in after a meeting with his bosses saying, right, Amazon is going to sell games through through Twitch or through another app. We're going to supplant Steam. And the people he's hired who know the games industry saying to him, you can't really do that. What effect you're arguing is you're going to take our game out of Steam, which is a problem. And what games are you going to sell on this new Amazon Steam? And there'll be lots of things like that. And then simultaneously, this Lumberyard game engine I spoke of, they'd be setting things to render that in Unreal Engine maybe takes a few minutes, and they would just go and play Halo or go for lunch because they knew the rendering would take so long. All these kind of little things. And then finally, the real kind of bummer is that there are people in the story telling Schreier that some of the issues around, if not sexual harassment, and certainly the problems of a kind of a male-dominated bro-y kind of culture have come into Amazon or decent Amazon games out of these kind of games environments. So they're kind of, if the article's accurate, and I have no reason to think it's not, Amazon has, sadly for them, they have the worst of everything.
Yeah.
And they're not getting any of the benefits they supposedly should be getting from bringing money into it.
Who could have imagined the emergence of a broy culture with a development tool called Lumberyard? I don't know. I mean, it's just a shock.
I'm just thinking Monty Python now. I tried Amazon Luna, and it was interesting because it works. I thought it was pretty decent. I felt it'd be better if I got the controller, but I've heard the controller isn't good. But in the end, I was like, okay, that was okay, but I don't actually need it. I still find myself playing Steam. I think the people, funnily enough, of all the massive corporations who look the most likely to actually capitalize the next 5 to 10 years in games, Microsoft is the obvious winner. And they're the ones who, they bet big way, in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
The first Xbox was a weird machine.
Yeah. But now they've got 20 some odd years of experience with this business, and it shows, right? They know where to make their big bets. And even though they haven't produced very good first party games in a long time now, probably 7 years,
right?
It's still, they know where the good games are and they know which studios to buy. And so that's, I think you're right. I mean, I think it shows that even if they don't have the same amount of money and cachet as Amazon and Google and Apple in terms of wider finance, they can still make smart bets,
right?
Because they've got experience.
I will say, like, I have sympathy with Amazon and others who aren't like in the gaming space, because so Amazon Luna, for example, those who don't know, so this is Amazon's Stadia effectively. And what you can do, what's interesting about that is I don't think you have to have base Luna to have the Ubisoft channel. And effectively, if you want to have Ubisoft cloud gaming, they basically just do it through Amazon. They more or less subcontracted it through that, as it were. But if you go to Amazon Video, you can buy HBO, right, as a bolt-on, the same way you do for cable. And some people do that. And I don't know how many video game players are going to do that, who are going to pay for an Ubisoft channel and then a Rockstar channel and then another channel. And the funny thing is, if you're an Amazon guy who doesn't know much about games, you're getting all this information on your computer about video game players. As people listening, as we all know, our guilt-ridden hearts, we spend a lot of money on games. Don't stop and tot up the price of the last 5 games you bought. Trust me, it's not good for your mental health. But despite that, so these people have all this information. Oh, John Harney, for example, this 39-year-old man spends a lot of money on games, so he'll buy the Ubisoft channel. But I'm not going to, and I don't know that I can. I feel like people who play a lot of video games and purchase them kind of instantly kind of see why they don't want to do that. But I have sympathy for the business types who are just like, we're just trying to exploit you, in the capitalist sense.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you let us do that? You let Steam do it. Steam walks all over you.
Oh gosh, they really do. They really do.
They really do. So it's a really fascinating thing, and I think I wouldn't go all the way with Schreier. I would worry a little bit about kind of giving almost magical qualities to the video game creative space. But then again, I think it is an interesting environment with its own background. Like, if people haven't read Masters of Doom, which is a fantastic paperback book about the first Doom game, the creation of it, that id Software era is absolutely fascinating. Like John Romero was kind of a weird dude. I mean, he was a young man, who was about to become a superstar, and he kind of knew it. And it's just the John Carmack, John Romero kind of synthesis of weird tech guy and weird guy who invented the concept of deathmatch, and they create a game about going into hell to fight demons. There's something there's something about that synthesis between the creative and the technical that is definitely still there, I think, at the successful studios. And it does seem that poor Amazon right now have just completely failed to recreate it or
Hmm.
capture it. And hiring people isn't enough,
Hmm.
you know?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, so fascinating. Go check it out. So speaking of massive corporations and Sony, the real reason I wanted to podcast today, Bob, is I want to hear about this the PlayStation 5. I want to congratulate you, the proud owner of a PlayStation 5.
I
Biden's
am.
America, PlayStation
I
5 on
know.
every shelf, at
I
least for
know.
Bob.
It's amazing. When Trump was still in office, couldn't get one. Now, first week of Biden, I was able to snag one. So I was able to, after several months of trying, get my hands on a PlayStation 5. I got it from my local Best Buy, went and picked it up. I got it all set up a couple nights ago, and I've been playing it for the past couple of days. And I'd say early reviews are really great. It is a very nice user experience, as they say. Really great menus, really snappiness to the presentation of the menus and the speed of the entire machine, and loading and downloading too is really fast. And I think all of that is amazing. Now, one of the things that's a little bit disappointing is that, John asked me before the show started, does it have that kind of new console feel? Like, you're really excited. You wake up every day and just like, I've got a PlayStation 5. And I do feel that a little bit, but it's kind of dented a bit because it also plays all of my PS4 games, which, on the one hand, you might say, oh, that's fantastic. Like you don't have to get a whole new library of games. They're just all right there. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But that also kind of points to the idea that there's not that much to play on the
Yeah.
PlayStation 5 right now. But I would say that playing this console, playing the games that are available has made me really hopeful so far about the future of games. I think last year, John and I, we'd had several discussions on air and off air about how, in certain respects, some of what's happening with game development and game publishing is a bit boring. It keeps going over the same grounds. It keeps promising innovation when none really happens. But I got the PlayStation 5, and I feel like a lot of that skepticism has gone away now because I look at this machine and I see a lot of opportunities, not only with the power of the machine and the user experience, but then also with things that I didn't expect, like the controller, which
Mm.
this controller, I think it's called the Sense controller. It is incredible. I think it's easily the best controller I've ever owned. It feels amazing. It's got a nice weight to it. And then also the best part of it is they really went in hard with haptic feedback, which has been a part
Mm.
of cell phones for quite a while. Particularly if you own an iPhone, they're very into
Mm.
haptics. But I would say that the best implementation of it I've seen so far is through this PlayStation 5 controller, which really makes you feel in touch with the game in a very visceral way. Like
Hmm.
they really give you, it's kind of like having pinpoint rumble to your controller. So it's not
Right.
like, just kind of a general rumble, but instead it's kind of a sense that you are feeling the game, you're touching the action in a way that it's hard to describe. You have to try it
Right.
out. And then similarly, there are various points in the games that I played. I've been playing Miles Morales and Astro's Playroom and then Bug Snacks. And in each one of those games, there are moments where sound comes from your controller. So it gives you a sense of almost surround sound, but then it
Huh.
also kind of a closer sense of contact with the game. And it's almost like somebody's whispering something to you as you're playing, like off in the background, even though it's just something in your hands. It's really an amazing feeling, and it's something that I'm a little bit disappointed so far by the games on offer, but
Right.
the technology I've seen so far makes me really excited about the games that will be coming in the next couple of years.
That's awesome. I will say, and it might just be anticipation of getting one myself at some point. Um, 6 months ago, I was writing off the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. It's like, if you have a decent PC, do you really need it? And I think that might still be true of the Series X, so it's tough to tell. But for example, something like ray tracing, which is the new hotness now. And like 6 months ago, I didn't really care. And now all I want to do is play Minecraft with ray tracing. But I don't want to spend hundreds of dollars on a graphics card to do that, basically for the price of a PS5. And now we could kind of match it. So I think I underestimated the impact that it could have, maybe the kind of the slow burn impact. I can't wait to get my hand on that controller. That sounds
It's
awesome.
incredible. I mean,
Awesome.
and I've been playing games, for many decades now, since 1985, 1986, something like that. And I think the easily best controller
Wow.
experience that I've had in those years. And it really, I mean, I just can't wait to see what developers do with it. And I should say that the pack-in game for the PlayStation 5, which is called Astro's Playroom,
Hmm.
it's a really good. It's completely designed. It's designed to train you to use the controller, and
Hmm.
but it's also a showpiece for developers to show them what can be done with this new controller and how it can be used. And it's a really great platforming game, 3D platformer. It's a bit like it's kind of Sony's version of Super Mario World,
Hmm.
or 3D World, or whatever you want to call it, Super Mario Odyssey, that type of thing. But it's a tech demo, but it's also a love letter to the history of the PlayStation. So if you're curious about what this console, how it adapts, maybe the kind of longer history of the PlayStation, there's a very real sense in Astro's Playroom that they developed this game, but then also the console itself, to pay homage to the longer history of PlayStations 1 through 4. And it's a really magical experience. I don't want to spoil it, because there is actually, it's weird to think of spoilers for a pack-in game, but there are kind of these wonderful little things that you can discover that, if you have been playing games for as long as I have, they're really a nice touch of nostalgia. And it really, I think, does a really good job of endearing you, the player, to the new console, right? And
That's
kind of
awesome.
seeing it as part of this longer history of the PlayStation. So it's great. I love it.
I want to get back to games actually in a second, but a quick question. What is the physical object of the PlayStation like? Because I've only seen it on screens. It just looks like this enormous thing.
It's
Um,
huge. It's
how,
huge. It's so big.
like, how does it feel? Like, I know it's huge, but like, does it look like this? Does it just look like this ridiculous thing in your living room, or does it look like a console? Like the Wii was the classic, like unobtrusive looking machine. This is
Mhm.
not that at
No,
all. Yeah.
no, this is something that's designed to stand out, and it looks like a spaceship that might have been included in a 1980s B sci-fi movie. It's kind of looks like something that could have been in the original Battlestar Galactica, or in the old Disney movie Flight of the Navigator, that kind of
Yeah.
look. And it's ginormous. And I had a PlayStation 4 Pro in my TV console before this point. And so that is a honking huge piece of technology as well. But this PlayStation 5 easily dwarfs it. And the PS5 barely fit into the same space that I had reserved for the PS4 Pro. Right. So I just
Wow.
switched them out, and it barely fits in there. There's barely enough clearance. And it, when you open it, it's obviously really wide, but you don't realize how
Uh-huh.
tall it is until you try to fit it into a small space. And what's really outrageous about it, and I mean, I'm not really angry about it. I think I love this about it, but the PlayStation 5, it has this wavy design. And so it can't sit level horizontally on its own. You need to use a stand for it. And so they provide you with what could be the worst piece of plastic that I've ever encountered in my life. Now, this stand, it can be used to put the PlayStation vertical, which I don't have space for in
Right.
my living room. So I'm doing it horizontal, but it also doubles as a horizontal stand. Ridiculous to think about needing a horizontal stand for a game console, but nevertheless, here we are. And this horizontal stand, it just barely clips on the back end of the console. And if you were to like
Oh no.
breathe on the PlayStation 5 the wrong way, it could come sliding off. The whole console would come sliding off of this horizontal stand going forward, right? Which is the worst possible outcome because there's a very good chance that you don't have something blocking the entrance for its spot in, whatever
Right.
shelf or console you have. So you just come right out of there, right? And it just come flying right out. I mean, it's just, I can't believe they shipped this thing with this terrible stand. I'm sure it works fine for vertical,
Right.
but for
Right.
horizontal, again, a horizontal stand. I keep every day, I'm just kind of walking around since I've gotten this PS5. I went on a walk this morning to drop some stuff at my daughter's school. And I was like, a horizontal stand. Why on earth would that exist? Why would that need to exist? So, but at the same time, even though the stand is so awful, I love the way this machine looks. And I
Yeah.
love that it's so weird. And I love that it kind of stands out in the living room. And I think it's great. So it's my review of the physical nature of this machine.
Well, I'm glad I asked. That was awesome. I just keep thinking of like a super creative type person, like it's Sony Europe or Sony Japan. Like I'm thinking Mugatu and Zoolander for some reason, and he designs this. They designed this machine, and someone said to them, "Well, what about for customers when I put it on its side?" And they just stormed out. I won't be part of this. You're on your own. And so they're like, "Crap, make a stand, and we'll just it's too late now."
Oh, I mean, it's so remarkable. I mean, it barely clips on the back. And honestly, I've had to at this point, kind of jostle some things around behind the TV and to adjust the HDMI cord that goes into the PlayStation 5. And each time that's happened, the machine falls out of its stand and I have to put it back in there. And it's just like, oh gosh. And then of course I've got a 2-year-old
I was
here
gonna say,
who just
yeah.
wants to touch everything. And so, who knows? I'm going to come down one morning. It's going to be 5:30 in the morning, and there's just going to be a PS5 on the floor. So I know that day's coming, but I can't
Yeah,
complain too much. It's really exciting to have a console so close to launch, and it's been many years since I've been able to afford having a
mhm,
console right as it launches, and so it's a great feeling. It's really exciting, and Astro's Playroom is a really great pack-in game. My
cool.
daughter's really been enjoying Bugsnax. Very, very strange game. And then I've been playing Miles Morales, which is the follow-up to the Spider-Man game, which came out on
Mhm.
PS4, I think 2 or 3 years ago.
Which is great. The original's
Yeah,
great.
and that game was great, and this one is good too. Although it's kind of just more of that. It's kind of just
Yeah.
more of that game. So if you're hoping for something a little bit different, I wouldn't say it's that different. I'm about 3 or 4 hours into it, so maybe it changes. But it's just kind of more of that game. But the visuals are just breathtaking, right? It's a game that was built for this machine, and it really shows. Like
Awesome.
zipping around in 4K with ray tracing, with all this lighting. I mean, it looks remarkable. So it's a real joy to play, if for no other reason than it's a technical marvel.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, so, like, what's the game you're having the most fun with on your PS5? Is it Morales?
I
Miles
think
Morales?
it's Astro's Playroom.
Oh,
It
cool.
is a really fun 3D platformer, and it is something that, I mean, I know it's supposed to be a tech demo, right? Really, it's
Mhm.
supposed to be something that celebrates the PlayStation legacy and then also attracts developers to think about this Pulse or Sense, I should say, Sense controller. But it's something that I look at. I'm just like, I just want a full game of this. Like, I want Astro's Playroom, at the same length as Super Mario Odyssey. Like a 10-hour game or something like that. So
Right, wow.
that was the game that I came away with just like, wow, this is really great. And it's because it makes use of the hardware, right? The controller,
Right.
the audio coming out of the controller. And I'm sure, it could be adapted to use other peripherals, but I just think that whole package together and the haptics of it are great. It's phenomenal. I just want more of that. That's what I want.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I was gonna, segue to what I've been playing, back here with the peasants playing, current generation stuff. No, but actually, joking aside, I just started the game finally the last couple of nights. Yakuza Like a Dragon,
Hmm.
which is the latest game in the Yakuza series, which is, for those who don't know, you play a Yakuza agent, but the Yakuza games are classic. You're walking around a pretty well realized section of a modern Japanese city. It is a beat 'em up, basically. And Yakuza Like a Dragon is effectively the same kind of a game, except you're kind of doing JRPG style combat, or kind of it's not they don't pause for real time like the classic Final Fantasy games did, but you're more or less doing that. Um, and the reason actually it's kind of an interesting segue is that, first of all, the game is really interesting. It looks great. I mean, I'm playing it on the PC. Actually, it looks great. But it's just funny because it's so resolutely a creature, not only of this generation, but arguably the prior generation. And like all the Yakuza games are like this. And Metal Gear Solid 4 in particular was a lot like this, where it's like, why does this kind of feel like a super nice, super souped up version of a PS2 game in some ways? And I mean things like the dialogue, text for the dialogue windows, and things like that. Like the fact that in Yakuza Like a Dragon, the characters all look great, but they haven't made that kind of leap that you see, for example, in The Last of Us Part Two or something like that. And they're not doing it to complain about the game, because I think it looks great and I'm really enjoying it. It's just kind of fascinating because I'm pretty sure that the Yakuza games on the PlayStation 5 will also just look like this. That they just kind of, I don't know. I guess at some point that becomes their thing. But that's been a lot of fun. And so far, I'd recommend it. Very kind of soap opera y. And then I've also, and segue into the final announcement in a few minutes about what's coming up next on History Respawned YouTube channel. I I haven't been playing Cyberpunk 2077 because I finally broke up with Cyberpunk 2077.
Mm.
It's a painful breakup. It took a long time. Um, I still have mostly fond feelings for that game. I'm tempted to go back, but I can say why we broke up without spoiling too much. Like a lot of games, it has a kind of a point of no return, which it tells you. So you're walking into this building, and it comes up going, "Hey," I think it literally calls it point of no return. If you want to do other stuff, wink, wink, you should probably do that now. Once you do this, you're effectively rounding up the game. And there were a couple of side quests I really wanted to do, um, which were kind of filling out storylines of side characters. But Cyberpunk is really weird because, like, sometimes it's doing a good job of that and sometimes it's not. So this particular mission, for the side mission, was one where you scope out a compound with the idea that you're going to sneak in, which is something the game wants you to do a lot. Now, the problem with that is the game is really garbage at stealth, and it's not a fun experience at all. So I said, I'm just going to run in and shoot people. And to cut a long story short, it took me 45 minutes of getting through this major action sequence, which was sometimes fun, but mostly not really. And then the game bugged out, and it popped me back to where I was at the start of that side mission. And that's when I realized that my relationship with Cyberpunk 2077 was over. And it was just so, and the weird thing about that game, I'm sorry, people are probably sick of hearing me talk about Cyberpunk 2077, but like, it's such an odd game because the technical problems are now infamous, but also, like, why can't you save your game in the middle of a gunfight? Like, that's not a bug. That was a decision they made, which makes zero sense because some of these action sequences go on for a long time. Um, why are they taking one of the more interesting NPCs? Her name is Claire. She's a bartender in one of these bars you go into early on, and to learn more about her and interact with that character, I need to play driving mini games in a game where the driving is just awful, as in, like, turning a corner it's just like, it's not a fun thing to do. So really, really strange game. And so when I was like 15, 20 hours into that game, and I would text you and stuff, and I'd say on this podcast, oh no, that game is good, I know people are frustrated with it, but it's definitely better than people think. Now I've gotten toward the reviewers all got, it's like, okay, now I see what they mean. And I'm sorry to say that game just flat out, they didn't finish it.
Mm.
Like, that, people are not exaggerating. The reviewers who've played the whole thing are not exaggerating. They didn't finish that game, and that is wild to me.
Mm-hmm.
Keanu Reeves is on my TV in the middle of football games. Do you know what I mean? Like, this
Mm-hmm.
is, it blows my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's great. Like, this isn't like Anthem, which had its problems, but like, Anthem wasn't. EA weren't pushing Anthem into the popular consciousness the way that Project Red, I think, successfully have done with Cyberpunk. Like, people who know nothing about games have been asking me about Cyberpunk.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's just, an unfinished video game. It's
No,
crazy.
and as we learned from Jason Schreier in the past few weeks, so much time and effort was poured in during that development process into the E3 demo that debuted,
Yeah.
I think 2 or 3 years back. And that's what really escalated the amount of attention on
Mhm.
this game. And yet, that work on that demo took them away from producing a final product. And
Yeah.
this is a story that happens all the time in game development, but it's one that I think, now has affected something that's really, really huge, like a really big game that people were very excited about, that journalists were very excited about, were not ashamed of showing their enthusiasm for. And yet now here we are. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's unfortunate. And I keep coming back to, what if I was a young kid, maybe not too young, obviously the game is mature, but if I was a young kid who, asked for this game for Christmas, got it for the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox One, and it's broken, right?
Yep.
That just would have been hugely disappointing. And they don't have the same kind of financial and otherwise, they don't have that wherewithal to kind of fix the problems like we do.
Right. Exactly.
So that's just that's annoying. It's
I
very
think
annoying.
that's such an important point. Now that the price point is going up a little bit for the next generation to $70, and for a pretty large subsection of video game fans, it's frustrating, but like it's doable.
Hmm.
But that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
$70 for one game is a lot of money for something that you might play for, especially if you're young and can play whenever you want. You play for a week or two and you're done. Like
Hmm.
that's not how it works. I mean, I mean, I don't see. I mean, I personally think the game is at its best when it's effectively a Fallout, like a Bethesda Fallout type game. And I think if they had just made it kind of a first person light RPG, light shooter in this amazing setting, because the city is amazing, um, I think that would be a good game. I don't see them stripping out the weird GTA elements that they put in. I don't know why they did that. Um, but there's good stuff there. So the next History Respawn video episode, or at least coming in early February, we're going to do Cyberpunk, and I have actually invited a geographer to come and talk to me. His name is Professor Andre Sorensen, and he works at the University of Toronto, and he's an expert on urban spaces. He also knows quite a bit about Japanese cities, which very clearly influenced Night City. And we're going to talk about Night City and kind of how CD Projekt Red is kind of representing the future of a city and life within it. And I'm kind of looking forward to that. So he has some experience. He's not what you would call quote unquote an historian, but he's someone who knows a lot, particularly about the post-war development of urban spaces in the Western world and in Asia. And I'm really looking forward to that because Night City, there is stuff going on there. I think in our video game world, like it's frustrating so many doors are locked, and it's frustrating that a lot of the NPCs on the streets are kind of being, are you're going to very quickly see their coding, as it were, like what the programmers told them to do. But when you take a step back and look at the architecture and the interaction of things and what they tried to do, it's really amazing. It's really weird. I think you made an excellent analogy today, Bob, in a text to me, um, of a famous director from one film to another. I can't
Oh,
believe I'm
right.
drawing a blank on
Yeah,
this.
Michael Cimino. He was the director
Right.
for. We were in the midst of a text conversation. I know that I'm sure the podcast listeners love hearing relations of text conversations, but we were thinking about the ways in which CD Projekt Red had succeeded so hugely with The Witcher 3 and how much goodwill they had built up, and then
Hmm.
that Cyberpunk 2077 was a big disappointment, was kind of a huge shock and all of that. And it reminded me of a story from Hollywood. The director, Michael Cimino, who directed a very famous American movie called The Deer Hunter, which featured Christopher Walken, Meryl Streep, um,
De Niro.
Robert De Niro, lots of famous actors in that movie, did very well respected film, considered to be kind of a great classic film of the Vietnam era and about the Vietnam War. And he followed that up with one of the most hotly anticipated films of all time, which is a movie called Heaven's Gate. But that film famously had huge development problems, huge production problems. And then when it came out, it was nearly 4 hours long and considered to be one of the worst films ever made. And it's a film that's gotten a lot of kind of reappraisals over the years, but I think still the kind of problems with it have remained consistent.
Yeah.
And, I wonder, because I think a lot of people were looking for analogies to the Cyberpunk story and the shock of it. They were looking to those analogies in video games, but I think maybe this kind of story of Heaven's Gate is a more worthwhile analogy. Kind of helps us understand the situation a bit more. And I should say that Michael Cimino was never really the same after this
Right.
happened, and it makes me wonder what's next for CD Projekt Red.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic. I love that analogy because I watched Heaven's Gate again a couple of years ago. It's such a weird film, and it opens up with this like 45-minute thing of these guys graduating at Harvard in the 1880s, I think it is, and they're randomly fist fighting each other, and they're getting drunk. They're doing all these things that were happening in Harvard and Yale in the 19th century, and it's absolutely fascinating. And the sheer, like, you can, Deer Hunter is seen as this classic, and you can see Chimino. Oh, this is his genius in action. By the time you get to the end of the film, it's like, what was going on here? Like, it just, none of it ever comes together. And Cyberpunk really feels that way to me. There's parts of it where, like, this is wow. Like, some of the characters are great. Like, they're so good at writing characters, but then they'll give the characters kind of crappy dialogue, or the story will kind of go nowhere, and or it gets trapped in what is sometimes, to be perfectly frank, a pretty juvenile attempt at being edgy. And yeah, I also like, where do they go from here? I mean, these massive games are years in advance, right?
Hmm.
Like, what on earth do they do now?
Hmm.
I don't know. I
Hmm.
don't know. So yeah, so we'll look at the city, which I think Night City, the setting, which I think is one of the successes of the game, and I'm really looking forward to it. And yeah, well, that's what I got. I'm looking forward to more Yakuza Like a Dragon. Bob, you got anything more to share before we call it a day?
The only thing I would say is I played Control recently, which I think is a game that might be interesting to History Spawned listeners and viewers. It's one that was developed by Remedy, came out in the end of 2019. And in this game, you are playing as a young woman who's investigating the Federal Bureau of Control, which is a secret American agency which deals in paranormal activity and things that kind of affect alternate realities, right? So these kind of what they call objects of power. And so in this game, you go into this kind of federal bureau that has got this incredible brutalist architecture from like the late 1960s. And it reminds me a lot of the kind of brutalist architecture you see a lot of American universities, University of Texas, where I went in particular. Their main library, the PCL, is kind of a perfect modern example of brutalist architecture. And the game itself, I think it's a lot like other Remedy games in the sense that it has a very interesting story, very interesting world and style to it. If you're interested in not only brutalism, but the kind of idea about, government secrecy and redacted documents, this is definitely the type of story for you. But it has the same problem that I think all Remedy games have, is that the actual playing of the game gets really old really fast, and it's very repetitive. And the gems that you get out of the story just kind of barely make it worth it in a game that I think, in terms of actually playing, the third person action it just becomes very stale very quickly. But still, interesting experience, one that I've been thinking about doing for History Respawned, kind of marrying that up
Hmm.
with the recent Call of Duty Cold War game. It's kind of history of American secret operations. And I don't know, I might do something that I might not, who knows? But Control, I would say it's worth checking out if you are at all interested in those kind of topics and themes.
Awesome. That's awesome. That's great. I think it's a good place to leave it. Thanks everyone for listening. I really appreciate it. As always, if you're interested in supporting the work we're doing, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/history respawned. You can visit www.historyspawned for everything we do: podcasts, videos, little Monday updates I'm trying to do again, all these little things that we're doing on YouTube and everywhere else. And as always, we really appreciate the support, and thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.